I don't know how to describe it other than like a demon type of sound.
But it's silhouetted, hulking, every bit of 5.5 feet wide, 13 to 14 foot tall, pitch black.
The one thing that ran through my mind when I had this encounter was I don't have a big enough gun.
Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello, everyone. John and David are here with me today. We're going to talk about something that I think in the topic of Bigfoot has got to be one of the biggest parts of it, and it has to do with footprints. Our friend, the judge, and he is actually a judge for the state of Montana, said something to me once about, like with the Patterson film. He said if the Patterson film had gone into a court of law, it would have been a slam dunk because you have two credible witnesses, you have film footage, photographic evidence, and you have footprints, physical evidence. So what I want to do is I want to go through and we'll discuss from John Green's 1968 book On the Track of the Sasquatch. And much of what he puts in this chapter about footprints is still very relevant today. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of go through it little by little, especially since my reading, I try to go too fast and it kind of sucks when I do that. So I want to go through a little at a time and then you guys sort of, comment. And John, I particularly was interested in your outlook on this, having a medical background and all. So Let me start in here. He says, and you got to remember, again, this was 1968 when he published this, so there's been things since then, but much of this is still very relevant. So he says, without footprints, the Sasquatch would present no problem. They would be dismissed as a mixture of legends and lies, with perhaps an occasional hallucination thrown in. But none of those easy explanations can be applied to holes in the ground. Something has to make them. There are only two possible explanations. At least I have never met anyone who could suggest a third. They are either made by men, or they are made by some creature with feet the right size and shape. Such a creature would have to be very large, yet unknown to science, and a close relative of the man. The very idea is ridiculous. Alternatively, there must be a widespread, well-financed, continuing organization devoted to the faking of big tracks all over Western North America. That is also ridiculous. So, and it's not just Western North America, of course. When he was doing this in 68, that was kind of the main focus, what they were doing. And we know since then it's much more widespread than that. So what do you guys think about that so far?
Well,
I think that's a very accurate statement.
Yeah, and the fact that anybody would even try to rack it up as a hoax, I mean, today it's a worldwide phenomenon. So, I mean, that's just ludicrous.
And I think he puts in here, we'll get to that, excuse me, where he says, now, again, we're talking 1968, or he actually wrote this probably in 66 or 67.
Right.
But at that point, he mentions later, and when we get to that, you'll recall this, but he says, at this juncture, it was already 70 years of knowledge about footprints.
Yeah.
At least. Yeah. Were there not footprints, 1811, I think, where there were some reported Bigfoot tracks or unknown creature tracks that were seen by one of the frontiersmen. Can't think of the guy's name, but he wrote about it and said that they weren't bare footprints, but they had been 14 by 8 inches and tapered at the heel. So you're talking back 1811, probably over 100 years, really, 150 years by that point.
Yeah, that was probably one of the earliest documents, and I think Green mentions that in his files, or at least he told me that I think the earliest recollection he could find in print was around 1811.
Yep.
Okay, so let's go on to the next paragraph. That approach to the problem is just one serious weakness. The tracks do exist. Something in Western North America goes around making enormous human-like tracks. That is a fact which science has so far chosen to ignore, but which is in no way able to explain. And I find that interesting, too. It's like scientists since this time have sort of glazed over the issue. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, anybody in science and other fields just want to totally dismiss tracks that are found.
Yeah, they don't want to be ridiculed by their, what's the word I'm looking for?
Colleagues.
By their colleagues,
yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that's a very real thing because, I can tell you having, been in the sciences since 1994, really, topics like this were brought up and laughed at. Nobody even is open-minded enough to take it. Well, few people are open-minded enough to take it seriously. And if people were to find out that you think that there's some credibility to it or that you think that some of the evidence presented is actually, something to look at, people would immediately start to question your scientific credibility even in other areas of science. So it's a very real thing. It's a very real thing, and it's a concern that I'm sure plenty of people out there do look at these things seriously, but they wouldn't say anything about it.
It's interesting. Yeah. I've mentioned this numerous times before. Our police friend, TW, was taking a course when he went back to get a second degree. And I can't remember what the course was, but they had to do a paper, and he decided to do it on Bigfoot. And not only the professor, but of course all the other students laughed him just about out of the room. And he went and had a private talk with the professor, and the professor says, well, I might believe in it, but there are no juvenile, footprints. So TW emailed me and asked me about juvenile prints. I sent him, half a dozen different individual juvenile footprint photos. He took them to the professor, and the guy was shocked. Then he changed his whole attitude. But so I just don't know. I think a lot of it is maybe personal prejudices where they don't want to look into something or just don't want to get caught up in what they might perceive as a bunch of nonsense.
Well, one thing
I think part of the problem.
Go ahead, John.
Go ahead, David.
Well,
I was just going to make a quick remark that the name Bigfoot also is something that if it had a different name that like we were referring to it by some scientific name that we thought it could be or something like that, it would probably be taken more seriously. But when you say the word Bigfoot, it just sounds like a child's game or a child's monster,
Yeah, there's been so much there's been so much nonsense attributed to the subject for decades that I think that word brings up that vision in people's minds.
Well, it's like John was saying a while ago. I mean, if you stick your neck out and you say you believe in this or you're interested in it or you think it's a possibility, your colleagues are going to start to question your knowledge and how you do things. And a lot of these professors or teachers, they're trying to get their tenure at a university or a college. And if they do anything like this, they're done.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph. The footprints may be close to 20 inches in length and range from there down to a size where they can no longer be definitely distinguished from a human footprint. They resemble the print of a human foot in that they are plantigrade. That is, the entire foot from heel to toe rests on the ground, and they have a big toe on the inside which is considerably larger than the other toes and extends beyond them. And that's true in most cases. Now, I do have a few casts where the big toe looks similar in size to the other prints, but I believe that's the smaller prints. And I don't know if that changes with growth and all that, or it's just simply variation in the species.
Sure. I mean, we have variation ourselves. Some people have a less prominent big toe and some people have a more prominent big toe, just genetics. Variations. I've seen people who have very prominent middle toes. It looks like they're flipping you off with their foot. It's just, you have some variability in these kinds of things for sure, amongst any species.
I think it is variation. I mean, you look at, like John was saying, you look at humans, a lot of people, if you look at their feet, some people, their toes are really close together. Some people, there's gaps. I mean, it just depends.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so he says they differ from the normal human track in that they are flat, in most cases without any sign of an arch, and that their width is very great in proportion to their length. Typical print 16 inches long is almost 8 inches across the ball and 5 inches across the heel. A shoe manufacturer has been quoted as saying that one particular 15-inch print would require a size 21 shoe for length, but the width would have to be 13 sizes greater than the widest shoe made. A foot of normal human proportion, 16 inches long, would probably not be over 6 inches wide, although the print of a person customarily going barefoot may tend to be wider and flatter than that of a person wearing shoes. So that's a big difference.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the flatness of the foot is something that's always sort of bothered me. The footprints do all seem to show a flat foot. And the only reason that kind of makes me think about anatomically with this creature would be that that would put a lot of pressure on the Achilles tendon as they're walking, especially up mountainous terrains and so on. And I guess, you don't know what kind of joints they might have in their ankle and additional flexibilities in the way that they walk and everything. But, certainly if they walk like we do, bipedally or similar to us, having a completely flat foot and traversing over mountainous terrains where you're putting a lot of stretch on that Achilles tendon, I would think that it would make them more prone to Achilles tendon ruptures, and then you'd have creatures which wouldn't be able to walk or which would heal up over 3 to 6 months. They wouldn't be able to walk and wouldn't be able to eat or catch their own food and so on. Whereas we've talked about this before, Will, the idea of, is there this mid-tarsal break or not?
Right.
And I could imagine a creature with a flat footprint, if they did have some kind of a joint somewhere, maybe not the mid-tarsal break, if that's not something that these creatures have, but a joint somewhere where they need to be more flexible. Otherwise, that Achilles tendon would just have a lot of pressure on it, the way these things are going up and down hilly and mountainous terrains. And I would imagine that there would be a lot of, as they age especially, more prone to breaking their Achilles tendons and having, completely debilitating physical injury.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always kind of confused me about the flatness of the foot.
Yeah, that alone with the Achilles, that tells me that the tarsals and the phalanges would be much different than ours, just because of the weight they're supporting and the way they move.
Well, you got to remember too,
Sure.
they don't walk the same way we do.
Right.
They have a very thick pad on the foot, and they place their feet differently. Their foot doesn't roll from back to front like ours do. They sort of pick it up, lift it, and then set it down. So it's structurally very different, not just the foot, but I think their whole skeletal structure.
Well, when you think about
that makes sense.
When you think about how big their foot is, their phalanges has to be longer than our fingers. That's big.
It could be. And here's something too. A lot of the tracks show what looks like their toes are curled when they're walking.
Yep.
Okay, let's go on. The shape of the big footprints is not particularly consistent. This is interesting too. However, most of those I've seen are sufficiently distinctive in shape so that they would be readily recognizable, even if all the same length. Some, such as the 14.5-inch tracks cast in early California in October of '67, and he's referring to Patterson's Sasquatch here, are proportionately narrow. One 13-inch track has toes widely fanned out. Two fairly short tracks with narrow heels are as wide as the largest tracks at the ball and have the largest toes. There's one track approximately 11 inches long that has a fairly deep arch. For size and shape, this could well be a human track, but it has appeared alongside the big tracks, and the depth of the impression indicates that although the feet are not large, the creature is very heavy. And I've seen prints like that too, where they're not particularly long. They could very well be human, except for the depth. Some that were photographed here just a year or two ago show that they look very much like human tracks. They're about the same length, but the person who took the pictures weighed around 200 pounds and barely made an impression in the material next to the tracks, while these tracks were several inches deep.
Yeah.
Well, and that assumes that the ground that the ground has the same basic strength when the two prints were done, I guess, right? Because if you had a lot of rain, maybe the ground was softer when one set of prints went through, and maybe, you know, this particular day it's a little bit harder, and so they look like they're different depths, but maybe, you know, the ground might have changed, I guess, is one idea.
Yeah, well, in this particular case I'm referring to, the tracks were fresh. So
yeah, okay, so then they would be the same in that case.
Right, within 24 hours of the
Was that
big
the juvenile tracks?
That's the ones were in Jason's area.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you what else is that you mentioned how the toes are splayed out. So that's an indicative of having a wild footprint or a wild foot stepping down. Our the toes don't splay out because we're wearing shoes all of our lives, and so our toes just kind of stay straight forward. And even when we're barefoot, we walk and our toes are all straight forward and in. Right. Having toes that splay out like that is an indicator that that's a wild foot that's making that footprint. It's not been in a shoe.
Okay, let me go on. He says some tracks are reported to show only 4 toes, and I have a picture of one of those myself, but it is one of a long line of prints, all of the rest which were 5-toed. Apparently the foot was held in such a way that one toe did not hit the ground. And I, like I said, I've got a bunch of footprint casts, different Sasquatches, and there are a couple that actually show where it looks like the small toe, and the small toe is shown, but it doesn't have the weight behind it to make a real big impression.
Right.
Well, that could just indicate that the creatures are putting most of their weight on the big toe or on the insides of the foot, which would make sense because that's your primary balance point anyway. And so if they're, you know, shifting the weight to the insides of the foot, maybe the outside just doesn't make a good footprint on that last toe.
And that's a good point because Tom and I, you know, a couple of years ago were talking about this very thing. And I was sitting in my office looking at some of the casts that I had laying where I could see them from the end to the front instead of looking at them at face value, so to speak. And you can see where the deeper part of the foot was on the inside of the foot, not the outside. So it does look like they were putting more weight on the inside of the foot.
Yeah, and depending on the terrain, that will affect it too.
Oh, sure.
True.
Okay, this is an interesting part here, and this is one that I think a lot of people get confused about, and I think they were at the time, but they made some very good points here. So he says, an unusual feature discernible in most of the tracks, in varying degrees, is a division right in the middle of what appears to be the ball of the foot. Ivan Sanderson, a noted English naturalist who is one person of scientific background who does study these things, has concluded from examination of one set of casts that the foot has a very long but partially webbed toes, with a pad under the first bone of the big toe. Frank Beebe, a wildlife illustrator at the British Columbia Museum, who studied casts of tracks of the same foot, although made 10 years later, decided that the double imprint proved the tracks were made by a person with false feet. The ball of the foot and his big toe showing through at the bottom. Such a suggestion finds readily acceptance among people who want to believe that the tracks are fakes. But it is actually nonsense. It implies that the false foot is so strong as to make deep impressions of the false heel, nearly 5 inches wide and of enormous false toes, but at the same time is so flimsy at the one selected point the details of the shape of the real foot inside it show through. In any event, it cannot apply to smaller tracks. Little longer than the human foot, yet those show the same divided ball. Or to the tracks where instead of being 2 well-rounded pads to the ball of the foot, there is a single pad with a sharp split running through it. I think I got a little muddled there, but what he's talking about is what people used to call the appearance of a double ball. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the casts show that. And I know people today, they're trying to say, oh, well, that's the mid-tarsal break, but I think what Green and Sanderson, as I get into this a little further, they have an explanation for the appearance of this double ball. So let me read that first, then we'll talk about it. Sanderson's theory, on the other hand, may well be correct. Human toes and fingers both have considerable webbing in front of their base joints. And on the human hand, calluses form primarily at the front end of the web rather than over the joint. Alternatively, the callus over the joint on the Sasquatch's foot may simply, got to turn the page, guys, may simply be so thick that it has to be split in order for the foot to bend. And that's something that people never really talked about. They didn't talk years ago about how thick the pad was on the Sasquatch foot. And I didn't think much about it either until I started staining the casts. And it really brings out a lot of the detail of just how thick those pads are. They're really thick. And if that foot pad does need to, I guess, make what looks like a split where the pad rolls a little bit in order for the foot to move. You know what I'm saying? Maybe that is the explanation.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
And I could imagine that the pad would have to be really thick if you're walking barefoot through woods that are full of, broken tree branches and, rocks and all kinds of things sticking out. You'd have to have a pretty thick and flexible pad in order to be able to move through that terrain without, having pain and considerable damage to your foot.
Well, and something you see in these casts is how that pad molds around objects on the ground. And quite a number of them that I have in my collection show that. So it does show very clearly how thick that pad is, and it probably accounts for how quiet they can move also when that soft tissue forms around objects on the ground. Or when we move, we're noisy because our foot is much more rigid, of course, wearing shoes, but even barefoot, I think we walk pretty noisily.
Yeah, with them, it's basically like they're walking on sponges.
Yeah, kind of like that. That's a good analogy.
It's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, and to take the skeptic's point of view, if I was hearing you right, people were saying that someone's wearing a fake footprint where they're putting their human foot into a much larger foot, and that what you're interpreting as the ball of the foot is actually the toes of the human footprint pressing down into a fake, bigger foot, if I was hearing that right. And if that were true, then you wouldn't get the indentations of the toes with the same kind of weight or pressure that the rest of the footprint was. It would look like basically a human footprint with just some very light toe marks on it if that were the case. So that argument holds no credibility with me. I can't see how that would ever work out.
And that's what Green was saying.
Yeah, I can't see how that's even a possibility.
No, but he did a really good job in, thinking this out. So he goes on, he says, so heavy a creature traveling barefoot over rough terrain would have to have extremely heavy pads on its feet, which is correct. It's what we see on these tracks. The most important thing about big footprints is neither the size nor their shape, but the depth in which they are impressed in the ground. This must vary, of course, in relation to the type of material in which they are made. In loose dust or snow over hard ground, they may be no deeper than the print of a human foot. But in mud, dirt, sand, hard snow, and sometimes even gravel, they will sink to depths far greater than a man's footprint. And I've actually seen this. You guys remember me talking about, my friend Carlo and Datus were arguing. They were arguing over a mud puddle, over a recent sighting, and it was a mud puddle. And I got disgusted and walked off and found these beautiful 18-inch tracks in this hard-packed gravel pile. There was a left and a right in that pile. Very deep. They were at least 6 inches deep into that stuff, and it was far too hard-packed for me to make an impression in it. So what he's saying here is exactly correct.
Yeah. And, an interesting experiment to do would be if you've got castings of these footprints, would be to take, let's just say, a wooden replica of these footprints, or maybe it'd have to be something harder than that, but attaching it to some kind of a pole where you could add weight to it and just keep adding weight to it until you get to the right depth of the impression of the footprint next to it, and see how heavy this would have to be in order to do it. And then you remember, well, that would only be the partial weight of because it's on 2 feet, so that would only be half of the weight. it'd be an interesting experiment. You could kind of determine what the weight would be based on that, but it's always force per unit area for pressure. So, the more force you have per unit area, the deeper that print's going to go. And you've got a wide surface area on those footprints, so it's got to be a really heavy animal. There's
Absolutely.
no other way it could be done.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so he goes on to say, I've seen 15-inch tracks an inch deep in hard-packed wet sand, where my own shoes did not leave a complete track at all. False feet worn by a person would show the opposite effect, tending to sink in less than the normal amount. As with snowshoes, many of the big tracks have more than 3 times the area of the normal human foot, as well as sinking in several times the depth. As far as I know, there has never been a systematic study of a set of these big prints by anyone specializing in relationship of weight to compression of the ground, although this is a field in which a great deal of specialized knowledge should be available.
Mm-hmm.
If not among students of tracks, then among civil engineers. I was present when the University of Physics technician examined a few rather poor tracks and concluded that they could not have been made by a weight of less than 300 pounds. To my own mind, I could not accept that some of the tracks I have seen could be impressed by the weight less than half a ton. So, and that's true. I mean, of course, we have more knowledge about this stuff now, but I think oftentimes people, when they see one of the creatures, they see the tracks, they make up an estimate of what they think the weight was. I did it myself the first time I saw 2 of the creatures. I guessed around 800 pounds, and in reality, they probably weighed much more than that, probably 12 or 1400 pounds.
Sure.
Yeah, it always gets me when you hear people doing that and they say, yeah, it's probably a 400 or 500 pound creature. And I'm like, dude.
Well, here's the thing. You go back to the Patterson Sasquatch. Early estimates said people were saying 300 pounds. Then later it was, I think, around 700 pounds people were saying. But they got to go back and look at what Patterson said. Patterson said, after they went back, because they took the film down to get it mailed off so it could be developed. And then they went back up there to cast tracks and do some tests. Patterson walked a 1,300-pound horse alongside the tracks. They didn't sink in as deep as the Sasquatch tracks were. So that tells me that Sasquatch was probably closer to 1,500 pounds.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Well, you think that the horse's weight, but then you want to, each track is, there's 4 legs, so,
True.
Each track isn't going to get the full weight of that animal. But at the same time, the surface area is so much smaller that, the force per unit area, unit areas, you're right, it would go in deeper, exactly. So when you're talking about side-by-side comparison, you could really, do some calculations there and come up with a pretty good estimate, I would think. But the animal would have to weigh much more than that horse. There's just no doubt about it. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so he goes on, he says, on this point, the following story appeared in the Humboldt Times, Eureka, California, November 18, 1958. Okay, so the story goes, another Bigfoot discovery broke in headlines in San Jose yesterday from Los Gatos, where Dr. M. Maurice Tripp, geologist and geophysicist, completed the cast of a 17-inch print he found in the Bluff Creek area of Humboldt's storied wilderness. Dr. Tripp reported that his engineering studies of the soil properties and depth of the footprints from which he made the cast indicate the weight on that huge puppy to have been more than 800 pounds. It's funny the things they put in articles, right?
Right.
But he indicated the weight was more than 800 pounds. The print is distinctly different from that of a bear or any other animal known in the area, Dr. Tripp told the San Jose News. The story admitted that although Dr. Tripp did not discount the chance of fraud, he believes that the tracks lend credibility. Several people have tried to track him. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I thought you were finished. Go ahead. Finish reading what you're going to read.
No, that's it.
Well, I was just thinking, he was saying that he can't discount the possibility of a fraud. Well, you talk about going into a court of law in a universe of limited unlimited possibilities. Yeah, I'm sure there's somebody that could have devised a machine that could put 800 pounds of pressure onto a footprint and take that up a mountainside and start stomping around hoping somebody would find it. But that seems highly unlikely compared to the possibility that there's a real animal that's making those footprints. And that's the easier of the two explanations.
Well, Green actually goes into that a little later on here. Okay, so several people have tried to track him, and in one instance, his footprints could be followed a distance of 1.5 miles through brush country. He said it would be difficult to fraudulently prepare hundreds of such tracks overnight, particularly in the type of country in which they were found. And that's true. He mentioned other evidence of Bigfoot in the area was a strand of hair found on a tree 7 feet 3 inches above the ground. Dr. Tripp said the hair was discovered immediately after reports had been received of the mysterious monster in the area. Dr. Tripp said his interest is both scientific and the result of curiosity. He first became interested 18 months ago when he received a report of a clergyman and a woman of Bluff Creek said they actually had seen the elusive Bigfoot. He was able to reach the region in time to get the cast of the footprint. So he got his 17-inch cast immediately after these people had their sighting. Okay, so it goes on. He says, now we just have to find the foot that fits it, he observed. Numerous expeditions have ventured into Bigfoot country, at least 2 of them conducted on a scientific basis. Many others were individual efforts, but none has come up with any scientific proof, either in photographs or by contact with the Mammoth Mystery Man of Humboldt. Indians in the area say the legend goes back to about 1850. Dr. Tripp is the first investigator of scientific note to estimate Bigfoots, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce that word. So now Green, and these days, now these guys, they weren't talking to anybody legal like our friend the judge, who is a legal expert. Of course, this was many decades ago. So Green says, in a sense, the footprints are physical evidence, and they're absolutely physical evidence, at least in terms of court of law. They can be photographed, measured, tested for compression. Plaster casts of them can be made, which must closely resemble the feet made at the prints. So that's what he's saying is, of course, when you cast something, that's an impression of the foot that made the impression. He says, on the other hand, footprints are not anything more than a shape bounded by the surface of some material. And they could be made by the removal of the material or by the velocity of impact as well as weight. Persons who have studied the big prints in the ground have always, in my experience, concluded that they were made by weight. However, I do not know that this has ever been established by scientific tests, which I am sure could readily be done. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, I understand Green's thinking there. He's trying to look at all angles, but it just doesn't, having seen many footprints, I would have never concluded they were excavated by, taking a spoon and digging out dirt and then, impressing it and making it look like a footprint.
Right.
He says, yeah, that seems pretty unlikely.
Yeah, especially if you've got a lot of them. I mean,
exactly. And you'd have to make them look all the same and have the same features. And you talk about some that have evidence of the toe gripping and so on and so forth. The creativity and the time and energy that would involve, I just can't really see that as a realistic possibility.
Yeah, and if you're trying to do it at night, so you're not caught if you're trying to fool people, I mean, that right there would screw you over.
Right.
Yep. Good point.
Okay, so he goes on to say, prints dug out or imprinted by velocity would almost certainly be of human manufacture. But if the imprinted by weight, they could be made by humans only with mechanical assistance. When zoologists are asked about the tracks, they can be counted on to suggest that they were made by bears. Remember, Tom used to say, those darn bears, they're always catching the blame. And I have often listened to explanations of how a bear's hind feet may overlap its front feet, leaving what appears to be a bipedal track. It is true that a bear's foot is plantigrade, but otherwise his track has little resemblance to the big prints. His longest toe is in the middle, and his outside toe, little toe of the human foot, is larger than the inside or big toe. he cannot make a deep track without leaving claw marks. And there are no bears with 16-inch feet this side of Alaska. No print made by overlapping feet would stand close examination, since a bear's front foot is much smaller than his hind foot, but carries the greater part of his weight, and therefore sinks a good deal deeper. An overlapping track would have to be very indistinct not to be recognized as such. While many of the Bigfoot tracks studied have been beautifully clear in every detail. So, I used to read where people would make that claim often, and I thought, well, now, what is there to that? Do the bear tracks look like that? And I even read some bear expert online talking about bears' lines of tracks and overlapping prints, and he claimed that every fifth track would be an overlapping track. And I'm here to tell you, and I went to the Bluff Creek area looking specifically for this to compare what my findings were compared to what these guys were finding in the 60s. When you go there late in the summer, August or so, because of the heat, there's what bodies of water there are in that area are pretty low, if not dried up altogether, but usually pretty low. So bears will walk around and leave beautiful tracks all over the place. I mean, I found thousands of bear tracks up there and cast quite a number of them. But out of all those tracks, I only found one time an overlapping track. And there were actually 3 footprints in it. And I mean, unless you were just, I don't know, really not knowledgeable about footprint toes and things like that, you could clearly see there were 3 sets of bear tracks there. So I cast it. So I'd have a copy of it. And it turns out overall it's 17 inches long, but when you lay it down to a 17-inch track that was cast at a place called Laird Meadow, which isn't far from where I found this particular track, there's no resemblance whatsoever. And within a line of bear tracks, and this one kind of makes me laugh sometimes, people will see a single footprint and they'll say, oh, that's a bear track. But when you look at the larger picture, where are the other tracks? In a line of bear tracks, they're always very close together, usually no more than a foot apart between their front and hind feet.
Yep.
They're unmistakable completely. So when people make that claim, it's just nonsense.
Well, not only that.
And I'm not an expert on bear tracks, but don't they normally have claws that you can see visibly on a bear track? Is that normally the case?
Here's sometimes later in the season. Now bears, their claws will wear down through the summer. And sometimes they won't leave claw marks, and I think that's the case actually in this particular one I mentioned where I cast this overlapping set with 3 tracks. I don't believe there are any claw marks in that one, and that was in pretty soft soil, so I think the bear's claws were worn down, or maybe they hold them up, I don't know, but I didn't see any in that one. But lots of other bear tracks I have pictures of, the claw marks are certainly there and the casts that I've made.
Well, with bear tracks, you also got the shape. A bear track is like the top of a triangle. They come to a point with the middle toe being the apex and then the 2 toes on each side of it. A Sasquatch track is not like that. A Sasquatch track is like a ramp almost.
Yeah, they're very
completely different.
Yeah, very different. Okay, let's see. Where are we at here? He says, once, of course, a zoologist has seen a cast or photo of a track, the bear theory is heard no more. And you don't hear that much anymore from people. Most of the photographs and casts of the big prints available are clear cut in outline, very clear tracks, if not in detail. And this has recently led to some suggestion that they may be faked because they show no evidence of motion. In fact, tracks showing heel slip, dragging toes, and the like are very common, and that's true. In fact, recently when we were at the Navajo reservation, even the old prints that we found up there that were 14 inches long and 8 inches across the heel, or 8 inches across the ball and 5 inches across the heel, which is right in line with what he mentioned in terms of measurements here, showed where the track had moved and pushed dirt out from the front and the toe off. Mm-hmm. It definitely showed motion. Okay. He says, but the amateur investigators who have made the photographs and cast have passed these over as being imperfect. They've been trying to record tracks with as nearly as possible to the exact shape of the foot that makes them. The only other creature with a large plantigrade foot would be one of the known apes, but all of these have an entirely different big toe, opposed to the other toes like a human thumb. Also, big apes when walking are basically quadruped, knuckle walkers, walking on the knuckles of their hands as well as their feet. A final possibility would be bears walking on their hind legs, but while a bear in the wild will rear up on its hind legs, he will not walk that way or go anywhere. And if he did, he could not take long strides. This brings up the final feature of the big tracks. They show a normal walking stride of 3 to 4 feet. Not out of the question for a tall human, but they can reach 6, 7, or even 10 feet when they appear to be hurrying. So that's another great point he makes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I really kind of get when people keep throwing that bear possibility out as a mistaken identity for Sasquatch. It just doesn't seem very feasible. There's so many differences, and I've heard it talked about on your show before, but the ears are different, the muzzle's different, the body shape is different, and they certainly aren't going to move fluidly like a biped would. It's just completely a different thing, and it's hard to believe that somebody even untrained in the wilderness would confuse the two.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about, sometimes when they've initially seen one of the creatures, maybe it was down doing something, and initially they got that initial impression because of the hair and color and everything. They thought it might have been a bear until it stood up.
Sure.
Yeah, you'll have people that'll see one and somebody will say, "Oh, you saw a bear. You're misidentifying what you saw," and the person's like, "No, bears don't have broad shoulders."
And then it'll walk away in 2 feet.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so he says the people who saw the tracks at Ruby Creek all agreed that the Sasquatch took a 4-foot railroad fence in stride. The same track crossed a potato patch and left the potatoes crushed under the ground, a feat which I thought unbelievable at the time. I've since been told that big bears can do the same. There's simply no way of guessing how often the big tracks are seen, but they are not uncommon. Big and obvious as they are, now this is very interesting, this part, guys. Big and obvious as they are often missed by even people who know they're there and are there looking for them. People who do see them know where to get in touch with any of the small group who are investigating these matters, meaning those guys. None of us were notified in 1963 when Bigfoot was making tracks night after night around the logging equipment above Bluff Creek. From August 1967 to January of 1968, I know of tracks being seen 7 times, 4 times in California, twice in Oregon, and once in Washington. One was in snow. 3 of these sets of tracks I saw myself and have seen casts or photographs of 3 more. The oldest photographs of a track I have seen is from 1924. I have only seen tracks myself in 2 parts of Northern California and in Washington, and 2 individual prints in British Columbia. I know people have seen them in Oregon and in various parts of British Columbia, and have reports by letter from Montana and Idaho. And you got to remember, these are the early days of this. Like I said, this was 1968, so the things that Green was getting was the stuff he was getting, and he's not talking about other people who were doing stuff.
Right.
He says the number of track reports known to me at the present time is well over 100 mark, and there would be no difficulty in accumulating many more. The following story, printed on October 15, 1958 in the Humboldt Times, may be of interest at this point. The story of ancient, mysterious, giant-sized tracks is an old story. Dr. T.D. McCown, professor of physical anthropology at the University of California, said yesterday. Speaking of Bigfoot's gigantic 16-inch tracks, which have appeared on the Bluff Creek access road construction job, Dr. McCown said that such tracks have been reported since the beginning of time. He said that records shown reports of footprints, most of them the same size as the ones found in Humboldt County. Such records indicate that millions of huge tracks have been found through the years. He did not specify the origin. Most of the track reports have come from Africa and Asia, although many have been reported in North and South America. Some tracks have also been found in Europe. the professor said. If the Humboldt County Bigfoot is tracked down and discovered, it will be the first time in history that the mystery has been solved, Dr. McCown said. He went on to say that there have been also many reports of tiny footprints, supposedly made by little people. That's interesting because some of our native friends frequently talk about little people, but we're not going to go into that portion. That's something for another time. But it's interesting that an anthropology professor had noted, the seemingly endless amount of footprints being seen over time.
Yeah.
Well, and the variety too. You talk about little footprints. It could be juveniles and things like that. You would expect to see a variety of different sizes. And I would even make the argument that, you should expect to see some signs occasionally of footprints where a creature maybe has an injury or something like that. And I don't know if there have been, any accounts of that, but that'd be an interesting thing to look for in some of these casts, like broken toes or, some injuries.
There is absolutely. In fact, there was a set of casts that Bob Titmus cast in, I want to say 1963, in Hyampom. And one of the tracks, they're 17-inch prints. One of them is a normal-looking foot. The other one, the toes it looked like it was injured at one point in its life. Then there's the cripplefoot tracks from Bossburg, Washington from 1970, where again, one of the tracks is normal. The other track, you can tell, was horribly crippled.
Yeah. So that's the thing you'd expect to see in some of these tracks, even though it might be a rare thing, you'd expect to see some of that come up, which lends credence to the reality of these things rather than just being a hoax with a guy in a rubber foot,
It's like I mentioned about TW's professor, he didn't think that he'd never seen any juvenile footprints. So I have lots of them in my files. And I sent TW about 6 different individuals showing. And, and it does lead credence to a living species of creature. You would have to see all these different facets of a population.
Exactly. Now this, I don't know if you want to get into this or not, Will, but this footprint that you're talking about, what kind of injury does it show?
I would have to send you the picture because I'm not familiar with that, but it's, you could look it up online. It's pretty easy to find it.
Sure.
But that's
interesting.
It looks like, the outside of the foot, and I believe it's the left foot, has 2 what looks like maybe the bones were broken pretty badly in the foot, and they're kind of almost like protrusions in 2 places. Interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. I'll have to look that up. Yeah, those kinds of things lend credibility to the reality of this. Now, I know there was a guy around that time that admitted to hoaxing some things, named Ray Wallace, right? And he was around, correct me if I'm wrong, was he not around the same time? Okay.
Well, Ray Wallace, he was the guy that was, and I don't remember what his title was, but he was the guy that put together all these contract road building and logging contracts in Bluff Creek and elsewhere. And so he would hire these crews to go out and do these jobs. And once reports started coming in and people finding these footprints, then he took an interest, and he was also with Bob Titmus, And then I think when John Green and Renee DeHinden and some of those people came in and kind of took over what was going on in those areas, personally, I think he was just kind of ticked off about it and, in a fit of sour grapes, decided to make the claim that he was faking the footprints. And I've seen his wooden feet. They used to be on display in Kalama. There's a little place there along the highway, and they look nothing like the prints that were found.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to just compare the ones that we know he hoaxed with to the real ones and just kind of show how the differences are. Because again, I get sick of this whole, people saying that, they're just people running around in fake wooden or rubber footprints. Well, let's take the fake ones and compare those castings to the real ones and show how they can't be the same and how different they are.
I think Green actually addresses that here. Let me move
great.
on to this. It says, I've seen myself that were, let me go back up a little bit. I've seen tracks myself that were far too deep to have been made by a human wearing a false feet. I've seen them at the bottom of a steep gully, where no heavy machinery could have been brought, and except by helicopter. And I've seen 600 yards of tracks made in in the short period when the top layer of deep dust was damp after a sprinkle of rain. None of the tracks I have seen appear to have been made by digging them out. And in fact, the tracks in the dust or the top skin of mud could not have been made that way, nor could they have been made with any kind of rigid mold, since they showed numerous distinct variations, particularly in toe positions, from print to print. And that's a good point. You know, if it's in a material where it's thin, and I've seen he has some of these pictures in his book where these prints are in very thin dust with a light sprinkling of rain in them. And he talked about, and I believe I've even got a cast of one of those prints, but where it's a little deeper, but where the toes move from print to print, that's pretty hard to refute.
Yes, absolutely.
They could not have made by anything mounted on a wheeled or tracked vehicle, as they're able to climb banks with foot still horizontal. I've never seen a set of tracks deep in the bush or followed the trail by any other sign on the ground where clear tracks could not have been seen and found the tracks again further on. But I've talked to other people who have done these things. Tracks are the most frequently reported in an area in Northern California between Klamath River and the Oregon border, and within 100 miles of the Pacific. There is no reason to believe that there is an unusual concentration of these creatures there, although I've seen several different tracks in the general area. The main thing is that there are numerous logging roads in a fairly restricted area, and the roads are not graveled. In the dry weather, the roads in use are deep dust, and in wet weather, all of them are muddy so that tracks can be seen at almost any time. Nor could anything cover much territory without crossing roads. This is in direct contrast with British Columbia, where logging roads are hard-packed gravel and will never show a plantigrade track, and where there is virtually unlimited wilderness into which wild creatures can move back away from any roads. So he's correct, and it's also Washington where most of the roads are hard-packed gravel, so you're not going to see prints. You know, they could very well be all over the place, and you wouldn't see tracks of them.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Okay. He says, I have not had the resources to investigate any great proportion of these reports of tracks I have heard of, but I've checked enough to know that in most cases when tracks are reported, they are there to be seen. There have been reports of what looked as if they might be Sasquatch tracks and turned out to be something else, of course, but I know of no instance where people have claimed to seeing a clear set of big human-like prints in which the report was fake. From this experience, move on here, I'm satisfied at least a good proportion of the old track reports and those that have been investigated must also be genuine. This sets a pattern that the tracks have been appearing for at least 70 years and all over an area well over 1,000 miles in length and 500,000 square miles in area. So it kind of goes back, what he's saying there, you know, that most of the track reports are legit because when they're reported, you can actually go and see the tracks. And over such a large area and time period, at this time, from 1968 back, he's talking 70 plus years that he knew of, and over 1 million square miles. So you're looking at time and geography. If someone were faking prints, how and why would be the big questions.
Exactly. And as you mentioned before, it would have to be a society of people that's doing this over time, not just one person, but there'd have to be a society of people that are out there hoaxing these things over a long period of time. That's ridiculous.
Just to coordinate something like that is crazy.
It is.
Yeah.
So he goes on, he says, once the idea of bears is disposed of, no one has been able to propose any explanation for these tracks beyond the two obvious ones, that they are manufactured by humans as a hoax, or that they are made by an enormous biped with a human-like foot, or human-like feet. Superficially, the hoax is by far the more acceptable idea, but it has difficulties. There is no apparent explanation of who would be doing the hoaxing, or why. Considering the time and distance involved, it would need to be the work of an organization rather than an individual. Still, people do strange things for no apparent reason, so perhaps the who and why should be ignored. The real difficulty is how. In a decade of wrestling with the problem, no one, to my knowledge, has ever devised a way to manufacture even a simple set of tracks. It is possible to duplicate a cast by pressing it into particularly soft ground, but no one has demonstrated that he can do anything more than that. Some years ago, a television program in California offered $1,000 to anyone who could tell how the Bigfoot tracks were made, but no one collected. The weight would obviously require a machine, and the machine would have to travel on feet without leaving any other kind of tracks. It would have to be able to climb and descend steep banks, vary the length of its stride and placing of its weight on the feet, and move its toes freely. So he thought that went out pretty well.
Yeah, I'd say so.
I think that's a very thorough thought process, and I think that, you know, the more I listen to it, the more convincing his argument is. That is exactly right. You'd have to have a very heavy piece of equipment. Yeah. You'd have to have a very heavy piece of equipment that's agile, leaves no other traces of anything, no wheelbase or anything else, and it would have to be able to go up and down steep embankments and, like you say, have flexion in the toes. There's just no way that I can imagine in my head that would be possible. It would have to be a living organism.
And you have to think about the time period he was writing this in also, and the kind of technology that would have been available then. It just doesn't seem like there's any way it could be done that way. You know, something.
Well, how about before the Industrial Revolution and people were having these footprints that they saw, and there was no equipment of any kind back then, you know?
Correct.
I mean, they didn't have anything.
Well, and he mentions tracks, the oldest photo he had or had seen was from 1924. Well, it certainly wasn't going to be anything like that during that time period. One of the things I look for when I'm in the field, too, is I don't just focus on looking for Bigfoot sign. I'm looking at people sign too. When we were up the Navajo reservation here a couple of weeks ago, one of the first things I'm looking at is the road to see how many vehicles had been into a place. You know, so I can kind of think in my mind, well, who's up here? What are they doing up here? Could they have done the things that we found? So I'm always putting that in the back of my mind too. Okay,
Smart.
He goes on. Yeah, he goes on, he says, another serious problem would be making hundreds or thousands of sets of tracks, some of them right around occupied houses, without ever being caught in the act. So that's true. Has anyone ever seen anybody faking tracks?
Good point.
Not only have I never heard of...
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, you know, you'd think that you'd have heard of some people reporting to police, hey, there's somebody in my backyard with this big piece of equipment doing something in my yard. Please come. I don't think I've ever heard of anything like that.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it has. I just have never heard of anything like that.
I'm with you there. He says, not only have I never heard of anyone seeing a man or a machine making the tracks, I have never heard of anyone seeing a set of tracks that stopped where they should have not have. Now, there's some people that claim that today, but what they're seeing, we saw it with Annabeth's tracks in Texas. She thought the tracks just stopped. Well, they didn't. I had to go film that whole line of tracks for me, and there were at least a couple hundred tracks in that line. At one point, they made a really bizarre left turn. And to a rational human mind, you would think, oh, you couldn't do that. That's just other tracks going the other way. And it's not. It was the single line of tracks. And I'd have to look to see what degree it turned, but it was super sharp to the left, going back the other direction. And only something with different mechanical structure than us would have been able to make a turn like that.
Well, and who's to say it's not dropping down on four legs at that point? And you know
That's
what I'm saying? They can have different forms of locomotion. They can also grab tree branches and climb up trees. So sometimes maybe when people see the tracks do something funny or make a sharp turn, the creature may be changing its locomotion style, or it may be climbing a tree nearby, or it may have jumped a good distance and the tracks are in a different place now.
So let's go on. He says, I'll go back over it. He says, I've never heard of anyone seeing a set of tracks that stopped where they should not have, as if the maker was interrupted at work. On the other hand, dozens of people were reported seeing a big, hairy biped making the tracks, or seeing the animal and finding the tracks there afterwards. And in your case, John, you guys heard that scream and went out the next day and found the tracks in that location. So that's in the same ballpark as what he's talking about there.
Exactly.
The idea of a complex hoaxing or organization making big tracks all over the western North America, one scoffer suggested quite seriously that it included hoaxers hoaxing other hoaxers. Well,
now we're getting out there.
I would love to see that one, but surely does not recommend itself to any reasonable man. Green was good.
That's called grasping at straws, Will.
It is.
Yeah.
He says, no matter how certain they may be that no big undiscovered animal exists, the only logical conclusion to be reached is that the tracks cannot possibly occur. But they do. I do not know of anyone who has ever studied a good set of tracks and has concluded that they were faked or that they were made by any known animal. Those who have not studied them raise a number of arguments that they would avoid if they had seen what they were talking about. Hardest to understand are the people who have been traveling in Northern California woods daily for years and who insist that there just aren't any of these footprints or that they would have seen them. Now, this is good. I have been told by a forestry man while we were within 50 yards of a set of tracks in plain view on a dirt pile right beside the road. So, and I was telling the guys in the field a couple of weeks ago, I said, we could be walking right, just because we're not seeing them doesn't mean, 100 feet away, we're not missing a line of tracks. It's just about coverage a lot of times. But he talks about this forestry work saying, I've never seen any in here. They were 50 yards away. A perfectly good set of tracks right in plain sight.
Well, you need a ground that can accept a footprint track and make a good track on the ground. You need one of these creatures to walk through that area, and then you need someone to find those tracks. And then on top of that, that person has to be willing to report those tracks. So 4 things have to happen in order for them to be found, and any one of those things doesn't happen. And
I'd say even a 5th one is the person has to be observant.
Right.
And a lot of people just aren't observant.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not looking for tracks when I'm just stomping around in the woods. I'd probably walk right on top of one and not even notice it unless I'm thinking about looking for them, actively.
So he goes on to say, I saw him drive past them twice, but he failed to notice anything. Even though his attention might well have been caught by a sheet of plastic, they're covering some of the tracks, protecting them from the rain. Presumably, he is still telling people that there are no tracks to be seen, or otherwise he would have seen them. So that's it for that chapter, guys. I mean, I was reading that the other day and I thought, we've really got to talk about this because it's very, very pertinent. Even today, everything he said. I don't think there's anything in there that's not relevant to this day.
Well, and this is the kind of scientific thinking that people have to approach this topic with, because that's how people take this stuff seriously. I mean, the 3 of us, we've seen the evidence, we've seen the creatures, we know. But to someone who hasn't, this is the way you have to approach things, is from a scientific point of view and ruling out possibilities or accepting other possibilities as and trying to go through what's the most likely thing. And if it's approached this way, instead of, talking about, no offense again to what people believe, I know everybody's got beliefs, but, talking about interdimensional beings and UFOs, throwing Bigfoots out of UFOs, and, if you approach it from this rigid scientific thought process, this is how you lend credibility to things, and you kind of can battle the skeptics on it. And it's not bad to be skeptic. It's not bad to be a skeptic as long as you're being open-minded about, the other side of things. And if you take that approach as being a skeptic, but you're looking at, what the reality of the situation is through a scientific lens, then you come up with real conclusions and not, people take it seriously. And I like that thought process John Green had.
And that was the process both him and DeHinden had in the very beginning of this, and that's the approach they took when they were trying to approach the scientific community. And even then, with these great points of view and the logical conclusions, scientists weren't interested.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just doesn't fit into their box of what they want to, they have a preconceived idea of what reality is, and if it doesn't fit inside of that box, then it can't be real. Rather than saying, I don't have a preconceived idea of what reality is, I'm open-minded to discovery. And that's how science should be, open-minded to new discoveries and ideas that take you outside of that box. Well, and as a former scientist myself, I was always looking outside of the box. But so many people are closed-minded and they can't get out of the little box they make for themselves.
Right. And I read one time and I thought it was a very pertinent point that, scientists are the people, when we have questions about things that we don't understand, they're the people we go to that are supposed to go out and investigate, regardless of what it is, go out and check it out. And we're just not seeing that today that much.
Yeah, it's a failure of teaching the scientific method properly in universities and in even before that in high schools and so on. It's a failure to teach the scientific method to think outside of the box and to discover, invent, and come up with new ideas about things, challenge old ideas about things. That's how science is supposed to function, but too much people just get comfortable inside of what they know, and they don't want anything outside of that must be wrong.
Yeah,
and there's so many things I hear, even things that I consider, not based on very much evidence. You can even look at the field of psychology and say that some of the things that are conclusions drawn, you can't really say that that's the truth because you're taking one human mind and trying to evaluate another human mind and come up with, exactly what's going on. And that's not really possible. It's a useful tool to guide with, but it's not science. It's not hard fact science.
One of my psych professors, she used to say, psychologists are right on borderline. They're kind of borderline with the people that are insane. So I know plenty of people in law enforcement. They say the same thing about other colleagues that some of them are borderline criminals.
Oh, yeah.
I believe it.
So John,
well,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Will.
I was just going to say,
I was going to open up
I was going to say, from a medical point of view, what do you think about what he said about footprints?
Everything sounds exactly solid. I mean, you think about the physics of making those footprints and, just about the, what it would take for that footprint to impress deeply into a surface, and it's very solid. It's based on what we know about physics. I don't think there's any question about the statements he made about the weight of the creatures or how the footprints could have possibly gone that deep. And in terms of the, anatomy and so on, it's interesting to hear that some of the footprints only have the 4 and the outer digit, doesn't impress very well. Of course, we know, I've never heard of a 4-footprinted, bipedal animal. So it would make sense if they're putting their weight on the inside of the foot. Again, something that we do sometimes too, and people can walk different ways, but it all adds up very well in terms of the way he approached it, and I think it's very solid reasoning.
David,
nothing that I heard was wrong.
Yeah. What are your thoughts, David?
I think he was spot on. I think he did a great job. He came at it from every angle possible. He addressed every question, every possibility. I don't think he could have done any better.
These days people always want something new. Everybody's saying, oh, well, we need to go to what's today, what's current. But sometimes you better go back and look at what the old timers had to say because they knew what they were talking about.
Yep.
I highly recommend people read John Green's books because if you want a foundation, if you're interested in getting involved in this, those first 3 books, On the Track of the Sasquatch from 1968, and we're going to be talking about and further shows about some other things from these other 2 books. He had other books, but these first 3, On the Track of the Sasquatch, The Year of the Sasquatch, and The Sasquatch File. Those to me are anybody should have those as a foundation in this. They really should.
Agreed.
Well, and I would say your books too, Will. I mean, I've bought some of your books and I've been going through some of your books and they're very well thought out, and I would recommend your books as well to look at as a good resource. And some of these things that we're talking about here, it doesn't take modern technology to understand or to comprehend or to evaluate these things. It just takes basic anatomy and physics. And those are things that people knew just as much about back then as they do today.
That's
So,
true. Sometimes you got to get
it's a
down
wealth
to the
of
basics,
information.
and yeah, you just have to get down to the basics and apply those basics.
Yep.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, anything further, guys? We're a little bit over our time, but
Well, I was going to bring up something, and it's a can of worms that you probably don't want to open in this episode, Will. But maybe in a future episode that I wanted to kind of talk about some of these DNA attempts that have been done on things, and we can save that for another episode. But that's something that I was interested in talking about with you.
Yeah, let's do that in another episode. So that's an entirely different topic. But
sure.
All right, guys. Well, listen, I think we'll wrap up here, folks. Thanks for stopping by, and we're doing experimenting with different kinds of stuff now. So it's interesting talking about things like this rather than just sitting around the campfire. Sometimes, that's fun to do, but some of these topics, I'll be going through things and they just kind of hit me like, we really need to talk about that. And that was one of these.
Some of this stuff definitely needs to be discussed.
Yeah, that was this one. Definitely, I put my new office together and I've got all these cast. I don't even have room for all of them. So, but I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, this stuff really has to be gone over.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, having said that, guys, thanks a lot. Everyone, thanks for stopping by.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.